The Knights of St. John, formerly known as the Knights Hospitalier, came to reside on the island of Malta from the year 1530. This island had been granted to them as a gift by the then Spanish king and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And over the course of the next 250 years, culture flourished, and the impact that the Knights had on this small little island in the Mediterranean became very apparent. But following the 250th anniversary of living on this Mediterranean island, the Maltese people became rather dissatisfied with their Knights of St. John masters. They were not living to the same high standards that the knights had once served in during the 16th and 17th centuries. The lack of morals and debauchery was rife across the knightly order, and so the island of Malta was ripe for a change in leadership. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. This time, I'm going to be going over the siege of Malta between 1798 and 1800, back when the French under Napoleon Bonaparte had taken control and tried desperately to hold on to the reins of this small Mediterranean island. In the build-up to the arrival of the French on Malta on June the 9th, 1798, the previous 10 years of French history are quite important. In short, you have the French Revolution, the execution by guillotine of Louis XVI of France and his Queen Marie Antoinette, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, this great French military leader, and the introduction of the First French Republic. On the 19th of May 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte set off from Toulon with the purpose and objective of going through the Mediterranean and cutting off the British access to Egypt and in turn its access to India. Napoleon has with him 40,000 men in order to achieve this goal. What Napoleon also came to utilise was the strategic geographical position of this small little island nation in the Mediterranean Sea. Ever since the Phoenicians, back in the 8th century BC, people had realised that this small little island could be used as a strategic placement, a springboard to wherever you so wish to go within the rest of the Mediterranean. So whilst Napoleon's intent was to go to Egypt and cut off the British supply and control of this North African territory, the idea was also to claim Malta, to utilise that strategic springboard. The French forces are spotted off of the Maltese coast some 3 weeks after leaving Toulon in the early June of 1798. On the 9th of June, Napoleon sends out a message to the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim, and requests that the Knights and the people of Malta resupply the French ships so that they can be on their merry way towards Egypt and their true objective of capturing this British territory. But the Knights are a neutral party. They say no. We have nothing to do with the British, and we have nothing to do with the French. We are not getting involved. Napoleon doesn't take no for an answer. Napoleon's negotiating tactics were pretty non-existent in this particular case. So Napoleon sends out 4 separate attack forces to take control of the main island of Malta and its next door companion, Gozo. Each attack force faces fairly limited resistance. So the first group ends up going towards Gozo, as I mentioned. Another group goes sort of all the way around the coast and ends up on the southeastern tip of the island at Marshlock Bay, captures one of the major forts there, and pretty much most of the coastal defences along this southeastern tip fall fairly quickly soon thereafter. And the third group goes towards St. Paul's Bay, where only 1 Maltese and 1 knight is actually killed. Gozo and Marshlock Bay have next to no casualties as well. But the main area of resistance is of course going to be the city of Valletta, and one of the first ships to land on the island of Malta via the French attack force was at Saint-Guillain, St. Julian's, at Spinola Bay. The knights that were at Saint-Guillain and the sort of outer edges of the main capital city of Valletta didn't put up much of a fight and actually retreated into the safety of the city walls. So the attack force came around and pretty much surrounded the city of Valletta. They were later joined by the attack force that had been attacking Marshlock Bay. So they too surrounded the city of Valletta. With the city of Valletta surrounded, attention turned to some of the French in order to capture the city of Medina, the sort of secondary capital to this small Maltese island. Now, the city council in Medina thought that it was little use trying to negotiate or even resist these French imposing forces, so capitulated and opened up their gates. What had started early in the morning on the 10th of June 1798 was completed by lunchtime. 99% of the island of Malta, Gozo, and the entirety of this particular area had been captured by the French. In the now bombarded city of Valletta, the Maltese people began to panic. The French were at their door, the island had been taken, and the Grand Master still remained in his palace. There were rumours that were spreading, suggesting that the Grand Master was about to surrender to Napoleon and his 40,000 men. The Maltese people began to riot, and in this skirmish a few of the knights were actually killed. But these rumours weren't necessarily unfounded, because just a day later, on the 11th of June, the Grand Master emerged from his palace and set the terms of his surrender. On the 12th, Napoleon arrived in Valletta and the terms were negotiated and agreed upon. After 2.5 centuries of living on this island, making it their own, creating it with all its splendour of art, architecture, came to a damp squib of an end. And the Knights of St. John were homeless once again. Now initially, things were looking pretty positive on the island of Malta. Napoleon left for Egypt on the 19th of June, and he left one of his top generals in charge of the island with 4,000 men. Claude-Henri Belgrand de Vaubois, the man who had landed at Spinola Bay at Saint-Guillain, had surrounded the city of Valletta and had captured Medina all by lunchtime. Now, during these initial attacks, the conclusions were brought about through negotiating that the Maltese people were allowed to keep their same rights and privileges as they had done during their time being ruled by the Knights of St. John. And even after this initial attack and into this sort of French period of occupation, it continued, but with a few changes that were made to fall more in line with the French Republic system of government that had only been brought in about a decade, roughly, before. Slavery was abolished, the aristocracy was abolished, the Vatican Inquisition was abolished, and they were booted out of their palace that was based in Burgos, one of the 3 cities just off of Valletta's harbour, Grand Harbour. A new municipal system was in place, dividing the island into 12 different districts. Some of the richest families within Malta were able to send 60 of their children to Paris to be educated by the top schooling and science-based facilities there. In Malta, the educational system stepped in, and the university that had once been based upon religion and the Knights of St. John was abolished and replaced with, again, a scientifically based facility. And 15 new schools were also constructed. Things seem pretty damned positive. But then it went wrong. The sheen and the luster of this new system started to wane by September, just 3 months after Vaubois was left in charge. Now, to explain this, I draw your attention to these 15 solid silver statues, which depict the 12 apostles alongside St. Paul, St. John the Baptist, and the Virgin Mary. These statues were made in Rome between 1741 and 1743 by the silversmith Antonio Arrighi. Initially, they were kept at St. John's Co-Cathedral in Valletta, but today are now on public display in the Bishop's Palace in Medina. Now, I draw your attention to this because the French, in all their reforms and changes to the governmental system and just general society in Malta, it also meant that the Catholic Church was theoretically abolished by the French. The Knights of St. John gone, and so had the Catholic faith. So the French decided that because they had abolished the Catholic faith, so to speak, that they were entitled to take and pilfer a lot of the valued treasures from these churches, from these cathedrals, to pay for the increasingly expensive expedition and campaign being waged in Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte. That was the big mistake for the French. Abolishing the Catholic Church for a society of people that were predominantly Catholic and had been for centuries, and then trying to steal their treasures and their icons. Big mistake. The Maltese people on the 2nd of September 1798 decided to riot, with the ensuing mob and Maltese rebels making offensive manoeuvres. The French decided to retreat to their 2 defensive positions. The city of Valletta, obviously, where Vaubois was and where he was the administrative lead, and the city of Medina, the sort of secondary base. Both these cities had 2 very different outcomes when facing off against the rebels. The city of Medina had the gates closed, the French fortifying each and every corner of the walls. But they didn't necessarily know that there were secret tunnels running underneath the city. The Maltese utilised that and captured the city fairly quickly. But in Valletta, the Maltese rebels put into effect 10,000 regular soldiers armed with 23 cannons and a series of gunboats in the Grand Harbour and off the coast to try and force their way in to the capital city. Now, although the city was surrounded by the rebels, the Maltese leadership under Emanuele Vitali and the canon Francesco Saverio Caruana thought that they could use a little bit of extra help in ousting the French. So they contacted the British, who were on their return journey from Egypt, and the Kingdom of Sicily. These two parties the Maltese thought would have a likely vested interest in taking the island and getting rid of the French. The British were the arch enemies of the French. Heck, they'd just been fighting them over in Egypt. And the Kingdom of Sicily had been the original owners of the island of Malta, even during the time of the Knights of St. John. You have to remember that the Knights were gifted this island. It was not an out-and-out independence of the island. Eventually, on the 25th of September 1798, a squadron of 13 British ships under the command of Captain Sir James Saumarez limped from Alexandria in Egypt to the Maltese Islands. They were in no way capable of directly assaulting Valletta and taking part in this siege and assisting the rebels that were surrounding the capital. But they did offer their negotiating skills, so met with representatives of Vaubois and offered terms of a truce. And as Vaubois put it, "You might have forgotten that the French hold this place. The fate of the inhabitants is none of your concern. As for your ultimatum, French soldiers are not accustomed to such a tone." The truce rejected, so began the British blockade of the Grand Harbour. Captain Saumarez gave 1,200 muskets and other general supplies to the Maltese rebels, besieging their capital of Valletta, and over the course of the next month, in October 1798, some 5 British ships arrived under the command of the famed Lord Horatio Nelson and Captain Alexander Ball. Saumarez unfortunately did have to leave this blockade soon after Nelson's arrival, because his ship was rather more battered and in poorer condition, having, as I mentioned previously, limped from Alexandria to Malta. The blockade was also assisted by 4 Portuguese vessels. Portugal and Britain had a lifelong allyship during the 18th century. So in total, we have roughly 20 ships blockading the Grand Harbour, stopping any attempts by the French to escape. Now, in the city of Valletta, there are 3,000 French soldiers. The other 1,000 odd that were stationed in Malta were either captured and held prisoner on the island of Gozo, some 220, and the rest had been captured at the city of Medina. Valletta had 3,000 men. They also had with them 6 ships, which they could attempt any escape from. But in the first 6 months of this particular blockade, the British came across a number of hindrances and problems that meant that this blockade wasn't as strong as it probably could have been. For a start, in the late January of 1799, 2 French vessels managed to slip by and enter the Grand Harbour, resupplying the garrison of French forces at Valletta. Then a much bigger problem arose when a French expeditionary force was spotted coming through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Western Mediterranean in the May of 1799. Lord Nelson, having had a lot of British vessels scattered throughout the region, not just in Malta, decided to regroup and try and tackle this expeditionary French force. That meant that the blockade blocking the Grand Harbour in Malta was slightly weaker. But although it was a slightly bit weaker, the blockade was still technically doing its job, because at exactly the same time, Vaubois and his 3,000 French soldiers held up in the city of Valletta were becoming increasingly desperate. So to eke out as much of the supplies as possible, Vaubois decides over the next 12 months to expel the Maltese population from a swelling 45,000 people in 1799 to just 9,000 people by the May of 1800, just 12 months later. On the 1st of November 1799, Lord Horatio Nelson, having regathered the blockade at the Grand Harbour, offered Vaubois an opportunity to surrender. But this was rejected once again. Keen to deserve the esteem of your nation as you seek that of ours, we are resolved to defend this fortress until the end. If one could describe the year of 1799 as slightly more favourable towards the French, considering certain hindrances that were made in the Mediterranean and towards the British blockade, then the year 1800 was the slow and steady decline of the French. In February 1800, the Kingdom of Sicily eventually answered the call and provided 1,200 troops to assist the Maltese rebels besieging the city of Valletta. Around the same time, 6 French vessels tried to break through the blockade to resupply the garrison stationed in the capital. Every ship was captured. 31st of March 1800, the garrison in Valletta got increasingly desperate, and Vaubois sent one of his ships to try and break out of the blockade and escape. It managed to get through, but it was hotly pursued by the British, destroyed, sunk, and 200 were killed. Another attempt was made by Vaubois and his men on the 24th of August 1800. 2 smaller French vessels left the harbour, slipped through, hotly pursued by the British, and only one managed to make it to the port city of Toulon. By the end of August 1800, most of the supplies had been eaten or used up by the French soldiers. In fact, every single animal that had been there had been eaten. On the 3rd of September 1800, Vaubois gathered his officers, and they agreed that in these now increasingly desperate times, they should probably surrender. The following day, this was signed into agreement, an absolute agreement that meant that now the British Empire was in control of the island of Malta. Their administration, their supplies, their fortifications were now under the British ruling. And thus concludes one of the 3 major sieges faced by the island of Malta, and commemorated each and every 8th of September with Victory Day, marking the conclusion of not only this particular siege, give or take a few days, but also the previous siege of 1565 and the following siege of the Second World War. And that also marks our conclusion for this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope you've come to understand something a little bit more about lesser known periods of history, not only in terms of Malta, but in terms of the sort of Napoleonic era. And I hope to see you in another video, either on Maltese history or any of the other back catalogue of videos that I have on my channel. But for now, I shall leave you to your day. See you later.